Ladies and gentlemen, this is my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Emmanuel Navon, who is the Israeli academic affiliated with several key institutions in Israel, among others, Herzliya Interdisciplinary Center. He is also a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He's also affiliated with the Kohelet Policy Forum, but he's also very active in the social media. You can find his comments in many different international media today. So on the behalf of the Center for International Relations, I would like to welcome you very warmly, Dr.
Thank you
Navon.
very much. Thank you for having me.
Today, we're going to talk about your recent book titled The Star and the Scepter, A Diplomatic History of Israel. And I found this book extremely interesting. I read it, and I read the whole book recently. And I would like to actually start with several questions to you. When I was reading your book, I had a feeling that in your assessment, you're quite critical towards the Palestinian leadership. Practically on every stage of the peace process, you indicated their, unwillingness to compromise. And you actually presented a very strong reflection that the Palestinian leadership was basically seeking the destruction of Israel. Is my impression correct?
Well, let's put it this way. The book does indeed relate to the Arab-Israeli conflict, even though this is definitely not the main issue of the book. But it also relates to Israel's relation with the Middle East, with the Arab states, and of course, with the Palestinians. I've tried to give a fair description of this relationship, but you're right that at the end of the day, I do think that there was a lack of willingness from the Palestinian leadership, most specifically from the PLO, during the Oslo process to reach a historical compromise with Israel. And I think that the main reason for that is that there's no willingness to really abandon this right of return, what the PLO calls the right of return, which in their opinion should apply not only to the refugees from 1948, but also to the descendants until today. According to the calculations of UNRWA, the UN agency that deals with the Palestinian refugees, this number today has reached about 5 million from 600 or 700,000 in 1948. And that right of return, or quote unquote so-called right of return, I say so-called because it has no basis in international law, should also apply to Israel proper, which of course is incompatible with a two-state solution. If we talk about a two-state solution, we're talking about a nation state for the Jews, a nation state for the Arabs, and therefore each country can apply its own right of return to its own borders, but not to the other side. And then of course there's the question of Jerusalem, on which there was always a complete refusal from the Palestinian leadership to any compromise on the Temple Mount, which has a historical and religious significance both for Judaism and Islam, for the Jewish people and for the Arabs. There were many proposals to compromise on the Temple Mount and on the refugee issue, both at the Camp David conference in 2000 and later on with the Clinton proposals in December 2000, again with the proposals of Israel's Prime Minister Ehud Olmert in 2008, and then again in 2014 with the efforts by US Secretary of State John Kerry to reach a compromise. On all instances, at the end of the day, both Arafat and his successor Mahmoud Abbas or Abu Mazen refused those compromises, even though they would have established a Palestinian state on nearly all of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with land swaps. But the issue here was, as I said, the refugees and Jerusalem. Of course, it does not mean that Israel is footless. I do not say that. But I do think that we had leaders in Israel that included Yitzhak Rabin, that included also Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, were willing to really cross the Rubicon, reach an agreement and establish a Palestinian state. But again, on the side of the Palestinian leadership, there was a refusal, as I said, to compromise on both the right of return and the question of Jerusalem, and most specifically, the Temple Mount.
And I would like to jump into this, into what you're saying. With that question, you've mentioned, of course, Oslo negotiations. Yitzhak Rabin, however, was not a politician um, favoring the establishment of the Palestinian state. He was so-called actually the security man, as they actually called him. So, can you please tell us actually when exactly two-state solution, in your view, two-state solution was embraced actually by the Israeli public and also Israeli politicians, because it didn't happen in 1993 or 4 and 5. It happened later.
So we need to understand that historically, Yitzhak Rabin came from the hawkish side of the Labor Party, and he started his career in the military. He was Israel's chief of staff during the Six-Day War of June 1967. He then became Israel's ambassador to the United States and then a member of Knesset for the Labor Party. When he was re-elected prime minister in 1992, he had a first stint in 1975, between 1975 and 1977. He came with the goal of reaching a political agreement based on the negotiation that had been started at the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. But he had obviously an issue with the PLO, and he did not want originally to deal with the PLO. Why? Because the PLO, whose name, by the way, is Palestine Liberation Organization. It doesn't say, it's not West Bank and Gaza Liberation Organization. That organization, by the way, was established in 1964, meaning 3 years before the Six-Day War and before Israel took control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And the PLO adopted in 1974 what it called the phased plan, which consisted of agreeing to establishing a Palestinian Authority and a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza only as a first step to continuing the whole liberation, so to speak, of Palestine, meaning the end of Israel. So Rabin was aware of that, and that's why he tried to negotiate. For many years, Israel tried to negotiate with Jordan, because don't forget that Jordan used to control the West Bank from 1949 to 1967 and wanted it back. Unfortunately, those negotiations with Jordan never actually produced anything because the king of Jordan was under pressure from the Arab League to let the PLO and Arafat take over. And then what happened also with Arafat is that he made the wrong choices during the Gulf War. By supporting Saddam Hussein, he was written off by the United States, which had started to have contacts with him, but he also lost his financial support from the Gulf states and from Saudi Arabia because of his support for Saddam Hussein. And Rabin really thought and hoped when he was re-elected in 1992 that Israel would be able to reach an agreement on the West Bank with Jordan and with the local Palestinian leadership. Don't forget that the PLO was exiled in Tunis for many years, and the Intifada, the first Intifada, erupted on the ground. It was not started originally by the PLO. And so what happened in 1993, when the negotiations took place in secret between some Israelis and the PLO in Norway, originally Yitzhak Rabin did not know about those negotiations. It was a track 2 or track 3 negotiation between academics from Israel and the PLO. And it's only because he had failed to reach an agreement during the negotiation that took place in Washington, having committed himself to an agreement within a year during the election, that he agreed to give it a try. And the reason why he agreed to give it a try is also because he figured that Arafat's position was so desperate that he would agree to sign anything. As I said, he had been written off by the United States. He had lost the funding of the Gulf states and of Saudi Arabia, and also he had lost the backing of his main international backer, which was the Soviet Union, which had just collapsed. So yes, Arafat was desperate, but the problem is that Arafat signed those agreements only to save himself, not with the intention of actually reaching a compromise with Israel. And that was the problem, I think, from day one with the Oslo agreements.
But going back to my original question, that was actually, when do you think Israelis Israeli politicians embrace actually two-state solution as a solution for the conflict?
Well, I would say that the concept, this idea, this slogan of a two-state solution started to appear in the Israeli political discourse mostly after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and mostly also with the establishment of the Peace Now movement in 1976. So, but at the time, what's interesting is that at the time when the concept was first aired in Israeli politics in the late or mid 1970s, it was very much identified with the radical left. And with time, it became progressively mainstream, to the point indeed that even the leader of the Israeli right, Benjamin Netanyahu, when he was re-elected in 2009 and gave his famous speech, the Bar Ilan speech in 2009, in which he announced for the first time that he would accept the principle of a Palestinian state and therefore of a two-state solution. And this goes to show how this concept went from being identified with the fringe of the radical left to mainstream and even adopted officially by the leader of Israel's right-wing party and right-wing government. But today, in 2020, this concept is not even relevant anymore, I would say, in the Israeli political discourse. I mean, I know that the issue of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and the two-state solution is very much the focus of the attention of international media and diplomats, but in Israel, it's become a non-issue in the Israeli political discourse. As you know, we've had 3 elections in a year and a half, and that issue was not even mentioned or barely mentioned by the political parties. So it started as a radical idea, it became mainstream, and now it's becoming irrelevant.
I'm gonna follow in a moment actually to get to the questions about the European Union, but let me just ask you also this question about the Camp David conference in July 2000. You described this conference in the whole chapter, and you refer to the Clinton parameters and of 93% of the West Bank for the future Palestinian state. And Ehud Barak, actually the prime minister at the time, accepted to a great extent, accepted this notion. Was he mistaken by accepting this 93% of the West Bank as a future Palestinian state?
Well, he accepted it because he was determined to implement the Oslo agreements and to implement a two-state solution. And I think the issue there was less an issue of percentages, because this percentage, which you mentioned, was actually improved by Clinton with his parameters in December, and they would have ended up with 95% of the West Bank with land swaps. Ehud Barak was determined to, I think, reach an agreement with Arafat, mostly because he thought that the situation of Israel controlling parts of the West Bank was unsustainable, mostly demographically, and also by the way, he accepted not only in terms of the size of the Palestinian state, but also a compromise on Jerusalem and on the status of the Temple Mount, with a sharing of sovereignty, which was not accepted at the time by most Israelis. And I think that Ehud Barak was, in my opinion, sincere in his efforts to reach an agreement, and what he produced, in fact, and that was not his intention, of course, but by accepting that proposal and by accepting later on the Clinton parameters in December 2000, he unintentionally caused a complete collapse of the Israeli left. Why? Because the Israeli left had become so identified with the Oslo Accords, the Oslo process, that when it collapsed completely and when Arafat actually rejected what the Israeli left all those years has been saying will bring us peace, then this theory lost all its credibility. And if you look at the state of the Israeli left and of the Labour Party since then, one of the reasons why they're so bitter at Ehud Barak is that they also blame him for causing their complete political collapse by, in fact, unintentionally revealing the true intentions of the PLO and of Arafat at the time, And so to answer your question, I think Barak, was he right or wrong? I think he was right to try. But what he ended up producing was very far from what he had intended, of course.
Let me actually go right now to the relations between Israel and Europe. You also actually wrote a separate chapter on this, actually describing the relations between Israel and Europe from the end of the World War II to the current times. How would you evaluate actually the Israel-European relations in the last decade? Is it progressing? Is there are some obstacles right now?
So I would say in the last decade, the relation with Israel and Europe is very much influenced by the profound changes going on in Europe itself. As you know, and you know this better than me, living in Europe and being European, that there is a divide within Europe today between countries and political parties that are in favor of deepening the European project. The policy, for example, of French President Macron, talking about European sovereignty, about European defense, about a European budget, and other forces, other countries, mostly, but not only in Eastern Europe, that are more in favor of national sovereignty and of limiting the powers of the of the European Commission. And of course, this phenomenon described as populism, the kind of rebellion against globalization, and the EU partially as a result of the 2008 financial crisis and the 2011 immigration crisis. And in a way, Israel finds itself in its relation with Europe as part of this debate, because of course, the relation between Israel and Europe is not only the bilateral relation between Israel and European countries, but it's also the relation between Israel and the European Union. And it is no secret that there are many political disagreements between Israel and the European Union on the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, on the question of settlements and of the trade agreements between Israel and Europe, on excluding from those agreements, for example, products coming from the settlements, etc. So we know those political disagreements. And the thing is, in recent years, Israel has been able to take advantage of those divisions that I described within Europe in order to strengthen its ties with, for example, the countries of the Visegrad Group, and using those special ties to block decisions from the European Council of Ministers, of Foreign Ministers, that require unanimity to take decisions on foreign policy. So in recent years, for example, there were attempts at the European Council of Foreign Ministers to pass resolutions against, for example, the transfer of the US Embassy to Jerusalem and other types of decisions. And those decisions did not pass thanks to the veto of countries such as Hungary or other countries of the Baltic states. And many of those countries see Israel as a model of a country that defends its national identity, national sovereignty, that is economically successful, that is at the forefront of the struggle against Islamic terrorism. And therefore, this relation, in a way, Israel has been able to kind of rebalance its relation with the European Union, also in the realm of energy. And that's also a very important point, because energy used to be the Achilles heel of Israel. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the oil embargo, the Arab League and OPEC used the oil weapon in order to isolate Israel and influence the foreign policy, especially of what was at the time the European Economic Community, against Israel. And the oil embargo, the post-1973 oil embargo, very much affected Israel's relation with the European Economic Community. Today, this also is being reversed, because Israel, first of all, since the oil embargoes of 1973, many things have changed in the energy market. There's no more oil weapon. The United States is energy independent. The oil prices have collapsed systematically in the past few years. And Israel itself has emerged as an energy exporter with its huge natural gas resources, which have enabled Israel to establish natural gas energy partnerships with European countries such as Cyprus, Greece, Italy, and last year to establish a natural gas forum with European countries as well as Egypt and Jordan. And so in a way, Israel has been able to rebalance its relation with the European Union, despite our political differences, as I said, thanks to, first of all, those divisions within the European Union and Israel's special ties with East European countries, and of course, the energy factor, which has completely transformed Israel's foreign relation in recent year. As I said, the energy used to be the Achilles heel of Israel's foreign policy, and today it has become an asset.
So it's also, you described and you named the relations between Central European countries and Israel as kind of a friendly relationships, on the opposition actually to the relationships with the old continent or the member states of the old Europe, if I put it this way. So what do you think is the foundation for those positive, as you described them, actually relations between Central European states and Israel?
Well, I think that, as I said, for many of those countries, Israel is really a model. As you know, the debate in Europe today between the different tendencies regarding the European Union has a lot to do with national identity, with national sovereignty, with the place that should be given to national institutions, to the struggle against radical Islam and Islamic terrorism. And on all those issues, I think Israel is considered a model by many of those countries, a country that is both a very successful economy, a modern economy, but also an Israeli society that is pretty traditional, definitely by European standards, with very high birth rates, with a society that is, as I said, traditional in its approach to tradition. And I think that these are things that appeal to many countries in Eastern Europe that very often feel that even though they did benefit from the European project and from joining the European Union, in a way, this kind of globalization in Europe has kind of gone too far, transferring too many power to the European Commission and taking them away from national governments. And also, I think that the part of the gap between many East European countries and Western Europe, I mean, definitely in the case of your country, for example, of Poland, the place of religion in the public discourse, the fact that, for example, in a country like France, it's openly a very secular country, there's nearly no church going, as opposed to a country like Poland, where there's a much more traditional approach to the Catholic Church and to religion in general. And Israel, in a way, is similar to that, because Israel, on the one hand, is a very modern country where you do not have an official religion, even though we are officially a Jewish state, but a Jewish state in terms of nationality. Judaism does not have the status of an official religion in Israel, and yet Israeli society happens to be quite traditional and respective of tradition. And I think this also creates kind of some kind of emotional case and symbiosis between Israel and some countries in Eastern Europe.
Which is actually very interesting that you mentioned that, because as we speak, there's some sort of a revolution happening right now in our country, in Poland, when it comes to the role of the Catholic Church and this kind of a traditional role and the model that you've just mentioned. There are similarities between Poland and Israel, but the situation is vibrantly changing, especially in our country when it comes to the role of the religion. But you're a specialist in the French policy, obviously. So I would like to ask you this, because you've just expressed your feelings about a European project and a slightly criticism towards actually as you said, shifting powers from the state, from the countries to the international formula of cooperation. This is actually what you just expressed when it comes to the European Union. So how do you see the role of France? How do you see the role of the French-Israeli relations now and in the future?
Right. So first of all, even though I am critical of certain aspects of the European Union, overall, I do think that the European Union is an achievement, a geopolitical achievement, in terms of preventing war in Europe and in terms of improving the economic growth and situation of the European continent. So I think that overall, even though I am critical of many aspects of the European Union, I think the project itself is a success and should be maintained. I happen to have opposed Brexit during the referendum of 2016, but I do think that the French, in my opinion, are overdoing it in trying to increase the powers of the European Union simply because they are scaring away many countries. And I don't think it is necessary to go further. And I think they scared away the British, they're scaring away many East European countries. I think the achievements of the European Union should be preserved, and I see no need for transferring more power at this point to the European Union and to the European Commission. I think the EU as it is today is good enough. And as a matter of fact, many things should be reformed and fixed. But the problem with the French and the European Union is that they're the ones who conceived the whole project in the first place. I mean, they're the one who conceived the European community, the European Steel and Coal Community in 1951, right? To try and tie their German neighbor to Europe. So it's really out of fear of Germany that the French came up with the idea of a European community for coal and steel in 1951, and turning it in 1957 into the European Economic Community. And by the way, same thing with the Euro and the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. That also was a French initiative by fear of Germany, of a unified Germany, trying to neutralize their threatening neighbor by creating a single currency, the euro. That also was a French initiative. And so France always saw, I would say, the European project as the best way to protect France historically from a too powerful Germany, whether it's through the common control of coal and steel in 1951 or the common control of the currency in 1991. And I think that also explains part of France's policy towards Israel, because originally France was Israel's best and only ally, not only in Europe but in the world. In the 1950s, in the mid-1950s, France was Israel's only military ally, not out of love, but out of a common enemy. And that common enemy was Egypt's president, Nasser, who was both the leader of the Arab world against Israel, supporting the Fedayeen, attacking Israelis from Gaza, but also the supporter of the FLN, the national movement of Algeria against France. And this common enmity towards Nasser created this alliance between France and Israel in the mid-1950s. And we even went to war together in 1956 with the Suez Campaign. And that war actually ended, it was a military success, but a diplomatic disaster, because the French and the British and the Israelis were basically ordered out of Sinai, both by Russia and by the United States. And this was a humiliation for France. And the day that France announced that it was willing to quit the Suez Canal, that very same day, when the French Foreign Minister Christian Pineau spoke with his American counterpart to announce that he accepted the American demand, the German Chancellor was in his office the same day, Konrad Adenauer, and he said to him, "Europe shall be your revenge," meaning we've become insignificant facing the power of the Soviet Union and the United States, and therefore we have to unite. And in a way, the French always perceived the European project also as the revenge vis-a-vis the United States after being humiliated at Suez in 1956. And that became even more so when de Gaulle came back to power in France in 1958, wanted to rebuild la grandeur de la France, France's greatness. And when he finally pulled out of Algeria and ended the war in Algeria and tried to rebuild France's relation with the Arab world, he also ended the alliance with Israel and became—
Let's make France be great again.
Right.
So
well,
speak.
yeah. So he get the copyright for that, and he basically adopted a very pro-Arab policy that was no longer, of course, consistent with the alliance with Israel, and that ended the alliance with France. And definitely after the 1973 Yom Kippur War and oil embargo, France became increasingly hostile vis-a-vis Israel and tried to use the European Economic Community as an avenue, as a tool to pass resolutions against Israel. And I would say that if France was Israel's closest ally in the 50s, it became its strongest critic in Europe in the 70s and the 80s. As I said, in recent years, the relation with Europe in general, with France in particular, has become more normalized. But yes, it went through many ups and downs, and this is related also to our relation with Europe and the European Union because of France's leading role in the European Union from day one.
And you also actually wrote extensively about relations between Israel and the Jewish diaspora, and it also go back to the question of Europe, of course, because we cannot run away from the obvious. I mean, there is a growing anti-Semitism in Europe, and that's becoming actually a problem in many countries, also including Poland. But we remember in different periods of time in the last 20 years, Israeli prime ministers who were trying actually to convey the message, especially to the French Jews. You remember this, I'm sure. Come to Israel. So the situation in France, especially not only in France, I'm just showing this example, deteriorated to the extent that actually the Jewish communities were willing, and it really happened when it comes to the French community. I mean, they moved to Netanya, to many areas on the north of Tel Aviv, to escape from Europe. To what extent? What is your view from Israel on this?
So, as I write in my book, the relation with the diaspora was always part of Israel's foreign policy, because, of course, there are many other countries in the world that have large diasporas. Think about China, think about Ireland, think about Greece. But in the case of Israel, of course, it is different because when Israel gained its independence in 1948, immediately it declared in its Declaration of Independence that it called upon diaspora Jews to join Israel. And then the new state of Israel passed almost immediately after its independence the law of return, which immediately granted automatic citizenship to any Jew who wants to immigrate to Israel. And that turned every Jew around the world into a potential citizen of Israel, whether or not they wanted to be. And of course, because of the size of large Jewish communities in countries such as the Soviet Union, France, or obviously the United States, very often this created tensions and diplomatic tensions, because in the Soviet Union, for example, you had 3 million Jews at the time of Israel's independence. And Israel was calling upon their free immigration to Israel, which obviously was considered as something unacceptable by the Soviet leadership, as something of Israel interfering with internal Soviet politics, and of course creating an alternative for Soviet Jews who didn't want to stay in the Soviet Union but wanted to practice their religion, to learn Hebrew, and asked to immigrate to Israel, something that was denied to them from the Soviet regime. So this positioning of Israel vis-a-vis the diaspora very much created a political and diplomatic crisis with the Soviet Union, for example. It was true also in a lesser extent with France, because of course French Jews, as opposed to Soviet Jews, were not prevented from immigrating. They lived in a free country. However, the French model of citizenship since the French Revolution, and I would say the official position of the French Republic towards its Jews was that, and that was the deal, if you like, of the French Revolution vis-a-vis its Jews. We grant you full citizenship, but you have to abandon the national, I would say, element of your identity. And that was stated very clearly in 1791 at the French National Assembly by a member of parliament by the name of Stanislas de Clermont-Tonnerre, who said, I'm willing to give everything to the Jews as citizens, but nothing as a nation. And that was also a demand made very clear by Napoleon Bonaparte when he convened the Sanhedrin, where he basically wanted an official decision by France's leading rabbis that the Jews were only a religion and no longer a nation. And now, with modern Zionism in the late 19th century and the establishment of the State of Israel, Israel, in a way, was introducing, if you like, an elephant in the room of France and a French jury by saying, you guys are still a nation and we are your true country. And that, of course, created a lot of tensions with France, and especially in recent years with waves of anti-Semitism in France when some Israeli prime ministers, Ariel Sharon did it, also Netanyahu, calling upon French Jews to immigrate. That is considered something unacceptable to the French leadership as as an interference in the national politics. But on the other hand, I think also today, in recent years, I think it's less of an issue because there's so many choices today in terms of where to live, which identity to adopt, today, I think nobody today waits for leaders of that or that country to tell them what to do. People are free to move wherever they want. They can work in different places. They can be, they can have their own identity, both as Israelis and living in Europe. So I think today there's so many more options of where to work, where to live, and be comfortable with your identity that I think it's less of an issue as it was in the past.
Dr. Navon, I'm not sure if I want to ask this question because that can open actually our discussion for another hour. But there's a question about the role of the UN in the Middle East peace process and the relations with Israel. And you harshly criticized this in your book. And so please, the floor is yours, so to speak.
Well, yes, there's also a chapter on the UN. And it's actually funny because my publisher, of course, he went through the whole book. And he said something about the chapter on the UN, which went through a few changes, by the way. He says, can you think of anything positive to say about the UN?
That's exactly what I thought when I read it.
And I said to him, no, I really can't think of anything. So the truth of the matter is that, look, as I say in my book, as I say in the chapter on the UN is not an identity, or is not an organization with its own identity or psychology. It's an international organization of sovereign states, and therefore, at the end of the day, what determines the policy and the behavior of the UN is the policy of the states that constitute the UN and the majority that you have at the General Assembly. So the UN is not a kind of organization with its own identity or its own behavior written in its DNA. What comes out of the UN is whatever majority you have in the organization itself. And I think that here we have to understand that the UN of today has nothing to do with the UN that was established in 1945. For the simple reason that in 1945, when the UN was established, it was established mostly by the countries that had won the war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. So true, of course, the Soviet Union was among the founding members because it had also won the war. But originally, there was, in fact, a majority of democracies and free countries at the United Nations, which is no longer the case today. The fact is that in the 1950s and 60s, with the process of the combined process of decolonization and the Arab-Israeli conflict, the structure of the organization completely changed. And the Soviet Union and its allies, as well as the Arab world, acquired a majority at the General Assembly. And especially after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Arab world and the Soviet Union made a cynical use of this majority at the General Assembly called the automatic majority to use it as a political tool to pass decisions to fight Israel on the diplomatic realm. And this is how you had this avalanche of obnoxious resolutions passed by the General Assembly in the 50s and the 80s. The most ominous example being, of course, the 1975 resolution passed by the Arab League and the Soviet Union defining Zionism as a form of racism. The purpose, of course, was to completely delegitimize Israel's very existence. And so, unfortunately, the UN became, in fact, the hostage, was hijacked, literally, for political reasons. And by the way, Israel was not the only target of this politicization. I think that at the end of the day, this hijacking of the organization has affected the UN itself, because it is because of this automatic majority that you had phenomena such as having Muammar Gaddafi's Libya be elected as the chair of the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Commission. At the time was the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, or the same year having Saddam Hussein's Iraq being elected as the chair of the Disarmament Commission of the General Assembly. And there are many more examples. In fact, it became so ridiculous that the General Secretary himself, Kofi Annan, said at the time, we need to reform this organization. And so there was a reform, and they dismantled the Human Rights Commission, but replaced it in 2006 by the Human Rights Council. And we know what's the Human Rights Council today. It is a council, a body that is supposed to deal with human rights, and that if you look at the membership of the council today, of the countries elected at the council, of course, the list includes countries such as China, Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, which still practices slavery. I mean, the world's worst human rights violators are there. And again, it is used, this body is used also to pass resolution all the time against Israel. And I think this affects also the credibility of this organization. And that is a shame, I think, because the UN does also some good things internationally. But when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, its role, in my opinion, is mostly negative, not only because it's been hijacked, as I said, by the Arab world, less so today, but it was definitely the case in the past, but also because, and that is also a very important point, the fact that the UN, instead of solving the refugee issue in the Arab-Israeli conflict, keeps making it worse. Because by continuing to fund UNRWA, you have to understand, I'll try to be brief on that, but you have two agencies at the UN that deal with refugees. You have the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and you have UNRWA. So the UNHCR deals with all refugees in the world, and only for the Palestinian refugees is there a separate agency, UNRWA. But the problem is, it's not only that you have two separate agencies, they also have two separate definitions of what a refugee is, because only UNRWA applies automatically the status of refugees to descendants from generation to generation. And therefore, the number of Palestinian refugees has gone from 700,000 in 1948 to 5 million today, and it keeps growing. But they're not refugees according to the definition of the UN Convention on Refugees, which does not apply automatically the status to descendants. And by the way, UNRWA also teaches children in the schools that they have a right of return to Haifa, to Beersheba, to Jaffa within Israel itself. And therefore, when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, especially the issue of refugees, the UN is not part of the solution, it is part of the problem.
Dr. Navon, I would like to end up with something more optimistic than your last chapter about the UN, which is the new day is coming. I mean, we have a absolutely new chapter, potentially, in the relations between Israeli and the Arab moderate, at least Arab moderate states, which is actually the Abraham Accords. Hopefully we'll have a chance in the future to speak about that as well. But this is something optimistic what I would like to conclude our discussions. Dr. Navon, I would like to thank you a lot actually for this meeting. I will, of course, include the link to your book in the description of our meeting, and I encourage everyone to read that. Actually, it was extremely interesting actually reading this book. Again, Dr. Navon,
thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.